The following webinar is presented by the E-Extension Farm Energy Community of Practice at extension.org and the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension.
Our topic today is solar PV economics, or solar photovoltaic economics, and this is really going to be a kind of a basic overview of solar PV economics and different ways to look at it, and kind of a tutorial on the complexity that it can become. And the reality is that I've gotten questions, and those of you on here, I bet, have also gotten questions where people will say things like, are these solar panels a good deal? Or is a small wind turbine a good deal? Well, that question is more complex to answer than you think it should be. It's not as if it's yes, it's a good deal, or no, it's a good deal. Really, it's kind of in between at the moment. It's not one of those things that's just a no-brainer. It's going to pay itself off in such a short time that it's a great deal. It's kind of in between, and it depends on where you are, and it depends on a lot of different sets of circumstances on your system, and we're going to go over some of those today. So welcome. If you do have questions, please ask them in the chat box on the upper left-hand corner of your screen, and I'll try to get to them as we go. I only have about 15 slides, and then I've got a couple of different spreadsheets that I put together that I think you'll find informative and useful as far as trying to look at this issue. So we're going to try to get this going here. This is my only slide that relates to energy efficiency, but to say that a kilowatt hour saved is always the best way to start. And so analyzing a house for how can I reduce my energy load is critically important. And anybody that hasn't looked at their electricity bill very closely probably isn't ready to put up a solar array at their home. They need to be looking at that electricity bill and understanding it, understanding how much they use and at what time of year they use it. Those are the best ways to start. You can save in a lot of different places: weatherization, insulation, air sealing, replacement of old appliances, etc. But I won't go over all those. This is really about photovoltaics. I did want to throw in, this is my house. This is one I put together a couple years ago, but this is my house across about a 3-year period, and you can see that I use the most electricity in the heat of the summer when my air conditioner runs, and I have a spike in winter when there's a lot of the fan going for the heater, as well as some winters I've used a little bit more space heating than others, and you can kind of see those. You can also see how bad the conditions were. The year 2012, which is in the lower left-hand corner, was very hot and very dry, and you can see that my air conditioner use in that summertime was greater than the others. I'd like to pull up some new data. I haven't gotten the next couple years charted yet, but I'm hoping that it's a little better. I've done a little insulation, a little work on my house since then, so hopefully it'll be a little lower, but you can kind of see what you can do as far as just get your electric bills. This is just pulled from my electric bills. I'm going to cover basically 4 different ways to look at solar PV economics, and that is payback period, the rate of return, the net present value, and the levelized cost of electricity. And then we're going to talk about how some other considerations, but how really no one of these is really a perfect measure as far as is this a good deal or isn't it. I think there's some that are better than others, but they're all worth looking at and trying to understand how the economics work and how different ones of these are influenced by different components. The real question about solar PV is why is someone going to install it? And I think that question, solar installers that I talk to say that one of the first questions they get asked is, what's the payback? But part of that is that they seem to realize that payback is kind of that first question. They're calling because they want solar. They've always thought about having solar, but that payback is something they've heard of, something they want to ask about, but it may not be that that's what they're really interested in. It's just maybe that's the first question they're asking. But the real question is that people install PV for many different reasons, but they want renewables. they have this desire to have to know that their electricity comes from renewable energy, and that's one of the main reasons they do. Economics are not the primary driver; it's the desire for renewables. Some of it is they want to produce their own electricity. They want to be more self-sustaining. That's a driver. The need for the electricity. There are some situations where remote systems could be put in, whether it be for charging a battery to run a weather station or something like that in a remote place, or to run a water pump for cattle water or animal water. If you have to pay to extend the grid, it might cost much less to put in some solar and produce from that sense. So the need for electricity in a remote situation. Marketing. I think marketing has to be thought about in some cases. If I've got a business and I want to market that I use clean electricity, I might think about solar panels, but then I may want them to be seen by the customers. And so then I might want to change my design so that my design can be maximized for the visual effect of being seen by the customers. And then I threw in investment. That's where we're going to look at the economics and determine whether that investment is good, bad, or otherwise. And again, that might depend on the person because a payback of 11 years might be good for one person, but not good enough for another, and that's up to the individual. Let's just briefly look at some of the costs. Some of the costs of the system. I talk to students and I say, it's a lot more than just the modules and the inverters and the rack. But those are the things we see. We see the panels, or we call them modules, the inverters, which convert that electricity, the DC electricity to AC, and the rack that holds up the panels. We see all that. The balance of the system is really important, not only for considering the cost, but also for doing it right. And that's all the things, and I'm sure I'm missing some, but all the grounding equipment, the wires, the conduit, weatherproofing all of that to, if you're putting it on a roof or something like that, the permits, the electrician, the electrical inspection, the structural support, if you have to reinforce the roof to put it on, you have to maybe rent equipment to get it put up there. You might have monitoring equipment. We're going to call that the balance of the system. And there's more than that as well, but those details are really important to making this thing work properly in the long term. And they also add quite a bit of cost to the system, and you can't discount that. This is a really important skill that I think if you pay attention to one thing and kind of take it home, I think this will be useful for you in talking with people about solar. And that is that here's a solar array or here's a solar panel. How much electricity will it generate? Well, with this equation, you can make an estimate that is very, very reasonable estimate, and it's really in the ballpark, and it works really well. Depending on the year, it's going to be a little bit higher or low, but it's really going to be close in the ballpark. And so, first thing we ask is, how big is the panel? What's the power rating of the panel? And so, in this case, I pulled up one that's a 250 right here, 250 watt panel, and we're going to use that number. And the nice thing about solar is it doesn't matter if there's one panel or 50. I could just scale it up. It all scales up perfectly. And so I'm going to take that 250 watts that I just said, and I'm going to, if I click, it'll show it 250. That's where I'm getting that. I'm pulling this 250 actually from the modules paperwork. I just looked up a module that I've seen commonly before online, and I pulled up the standard test conditions number here, 250. And then I'm going to multiply that times the number of hours of sunlight in a day on average. And so I looked up that, and here's the website I looked, but you might find it in other places. But in Lincoln, Nebraska, there's 4.79 hours of daylight on average every day. So I'm taking that times 4.79 times 365 days a year. And then I'm actually going to derate that a little bit, and I'll click on that, to an overall system efficiency. So there's system losses. My inverter is only 96% efficient. I'm losing some in the wires. I'm losing some because the panels are getting warm. There's different reasons, but I'm going to have some estimate. I'm going to tell you that that should be somewhere between 0.75 and 0.8. Usually works pretty good. And then if I take all of that, and remember I'm in watts and I want it in kilowatts because that's the units that we use, kilowatt hours. And so I have to divide by 1,000 to get to kilowatts, and I get 327 kilowatt hours in a year for that one panel. So if I've got, for that one module, if I have 16 modules on the roof, I multiply that times 16. That's a really good average number to look at as far as production for a year. Now, there's two numbers given on this data sheet, and I wanted to point this out. And this is the electrical data NOCT, or the nominal output, basically in real world conditions. This is more of a real world number. And then you can see the difference in the equations here. The only difference in the equations is that I did not use this overall system efficiency or derating number because that already took that into account. And so if you have access to the NOCT nominal number, you can feel free to use it. But if you don't, more common, you're going to get just the standard test conditions number of 250 or 280 or whatever the modules are. And again, you can see that works the same pretty well. 1.86 times number of hours in a day times 365 days divided by 1,000 gives you 325 kilowatt hours per year. And you can see those numbers there are pretty close. That makes sense, and they should be. I use this all the time. I see a solar array. I count the modules. I have some estimation of what size those are just because I've seen a number of them, or you could ask how big are those, and they'll say, well, they're 280 watt or they're 250 watt modules. You multiply that out, you say, I'll bet it generates this much electricity a year. And you're going to be pretty darn close most all the time. And I use when I do it in the back of my hand or I do it on my phone, I just use the number 5 for this number. But again, you can look that up for your state, and it's going to be pretty close. So, you've heard sometimes that some utilities may not want to hook a renewable system to the grid. Well, the federal law says that they have to. And so no matter what system you have, basically if you have a system that is safe, meets the safety requirements, they will and have to, any utility has to hook you to the grid. And that is based on a requirement from PURPA, the Public Utilities and Regulatory Commission Act. And but the reality is in that act, they are only required to pay a voided cost for any electricity that flows onto the grid under that system. And so that allows people to hook to the system for sure, but it doesn't necessarily give them the best value for that electricity, because if they go to work during the day and leave their house, everything shut off, that electricity during the day is going onto the grid. They're only getting a very small amount for those kilowatt hours. When they come home, they turn everything on, the sun goes down, then they're pulling from the grid. Well, they're paying retail rate for what comes off the grid, and there's no use of that solar basically if they're not at home when the sun is out. And so that doesn't add up real good when it comes to economics, and we'll talk about that here. And so when it comes to economics, the subsidies currently are very important, and yet the subsidies are also set to expire fairly soon, and so this is going to make a big difference. The two most important subsidies that are out there are a 30% federal investment tax credit that basically says that I can take the value of my system, the entire installed cost, and I can get a tax credit for up to 30% of that. And I can take that across multiple years if I need to, but I do have to have a tax burden to make that work. And so if I don't have a tax burden, I don't get the value. And a good example would be is if I'm a church and I put solar on the roof, I don't necessarily get this 30% tax credit because I don't pay taxes. But if I'm a homeowner or a business, I do pay taxes, I can take that tax credit. And that basically just takes 30% off the cost because I get that back as a tax credit at the end of the year. There's also the USDA Rural Energy for America program, or the REAP program, where farms and rural businesses can get a grant for up to 25%. Now, you add those two up and you say 30 and 25, that's 55%. Well, that's not true, because I've got to take 30% off and then I take 25% grant for the remainder. I can't double up, but I can double up, but I can't, it's not additive. But it's close to 50%, and that really makes for a good deal. Now, remember that that's farms and rural businesses. And a rural business is a business in a town outside of a metropolitan area, really outside of areas that are towns of over 50,000. So you can think in your states, there's many, many, many communities that are fairly good-sized communities that are still going to be considered rural and could qualify for this. So consider that. In Nebraska, I tell people, really, if you're outside of Lincoln or Omaha, you're rural. And there's only two towns that really are big enough to say, but if you're outside of those, and even really if you're on the outskirts of some of those, they may still let you qualify. So consider that, though it does have to be a business load. If this is a farm, if your major load on your farm is your farmhouse, this may not work. But if your major load is your farm shop and other areas of the farm, and your house is a small piece of it, it still might work. So you want to look into the details of that to make sure, see if that works. Net metering. Net metering allows you to take advantage of some of those electrons that you put on the grid that when you weren't home, as we were discussing a minute ago. And so in that case, you would say at the end of the time period that the net metering rule is written for, in Nebraska, that's at the end of every month, I look at what is my solar production, I subtract my energy consumed, basically, and I only pay for the net. And so if my energy consumed is higher, I pay only the net amount. If my solar is better, is greater, I actually will get, the utility will pay me, or they will roll over those kilowatt hours. The best scenario is when they roll over the kilowatt hours, because then they retain their full retail value. In Nebraska, we pay out we basically settle up at the end of every month, but in states like Iowa and others, or just ones I know of, that will let you roll those over from month to month, and even from year to year at times, depending on your state. You'll look at this map. The states in red have net metering policies as part of some state statute or state law. Other states have a few voluntary ones, like Texas and Idaho have some voluntary, utilities have some voluntary policies. And then there's 4 states that have no net metering policies at all, and the economics of solar in those states get much worse because of it. Net metering is a big deal because I can get full retail rate for most of the electricity I produce usually when I have a net metering law, while I'm only getting a portion of that value when I don't have net metering. Other states have subsidies and incentives, which really impact the payback periods and the economics of this. And some examples are, you might see a state that has a direct payment. And one of those that I know of is Oregon. And Oregon will say, we'll give you $1,000 per kilowatt installed just as a cash payment for putting in solar. And that's an incentive to help that economics be better. Here in Nebraska, there's some utilities that have voluntary programs, and they'll say, you know, if you put in a solar array, you'll get a smaller set of dollars back, but they're basing that on the fact that they're getting some value because that solar is putting out electricity during the peak time in the summer. And because they're reducing that peak just a little bit, they're willing to give some value for that. Performance-based, there are states that will give a performance-based incentive that says of 2 cents per kilowatt hour generated for a period of time. Again, that really will help with economics. And then we're seeing this less in the United States. It's pretty common in Europe, but we may see it more depending on how states deal with this 111D carbon legislation. But feed-in tariff. And a feed-in tariff is a policy which sets the price for renewable generation, like a solar array, at a rate that allows people to install it and have a competitive price for the electricity, or so it incentivizes them to install it so that they can get more installed. And a good example of that would be, let's say in Germany says we want this much of our electricity to be renewable, and they have that number. And the utilities have a choice. Well, a certain percent's got to be renewable, and maybe even a certain percent has to be solar. So we can either build a big solar array, a big solar farm, or we could pay a little more for the electricity and have the homeowners put all that capital outlay initially. And then they build it, put it on their house. I purchase it for a good price. In that case, what if somebody said to you, if you put 10 kW of solar on your roof or on your property, we'll pay you 30 cents a kilowatt hour for it. If we could put the numbers in, maybe we'll try that here in a few minutes. I think the numbers are going to turn out pretty darn good, and you may just be interested in doing something like that. And a feed-in tariff makes that available. Now, it's less common in the United States, but really if you want large-scale solar, it could happen. My estimation of how that might happen in the United States, I don't really foresee it, but if a state wanted to reduce its carbon emissions under the new carbon regulations from the EPA, they could say, we're going to try to get 20 megawatts of solar installed in our state, and we're just going to do that by giving a feed-in tariff and having homeowners put that on their homes, and thus we can claim 20 megawatts of solar, and it reduces our carbon footprint and helps us meet the 111D regulations. I can foresee that happening. I don't know if it will or not. There may be other methods that they find to do that, meet those regulations. Let's talk about the different types, and then we'll move into the numbers phase a little bit. Payback period, very simple. It's a period of time required to recoup the funds expended in investment or to reach that break-even point. And so I think that payback period is probably one of the best numbers to look at, though it has some issues as well, but it is one of the best. But again, all this depends on the complexity of the numbers that we're looking at, and if this is just simple payback or we're adding other things in. We'll talk about that. The rate of return, the gain or loss of an investment over a specified period expressed as a percentage over the initial investment cost. And so basically, if I made 4% on my money, the rate of return will be 4%, and that's above the initial investment. So we'll show you that as we do it. Net present value is basically how much the system. This is my definition of it. Don't get into economics on this first bullet point, but how much the system will generate or save above the cost of the system. So if my system costs $10,000 and I made over the whole time a total of $12,000, my net present value would be $2,000. So I paid back the $10,000 and I made $2,000. Yet the reality is that money today is worth more than money in the future, because there's this thing called depreciation, or not depreciation, this thing, inflation of money. And so money, we have some level of inflation that happens across time, and that money in my hand today is worth more than money out in the future, and so I've got to discount that by applying a discount rate of some kind. The challenge with that is that it's very difficult to be correct in estimating a discount rate, but the reality is that some discount should be applied. And then there's a definition of net present value that I put in. A positive net present value is good, a negative is bad. Negative means I'm not making any money. And finally, the levelized cost of electricity. We're seeing this a lot more, especially as you read some of the national data coming out with regard to energy outlook from the Energy Information Administration. The levelized cost is basically the total life cycle cost divided by the total lifetime energy production. And you'd say this coal-fired power plant can produce this much electricity over its lifetime. This is how much it costs. And you divide that out and say, if we were going to make no money, or this would be the cost of that electricity. Now, we have to be careful about using the levelized cost of energy, especially when we compare different types of generation, and I'll have a slide to discuss that here, maybe coming up, yes. So here's an example of that, and this is one of my last slides before we go into the numbers, but this is a part of the energy plan, the energy outlook from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And it is looking at what if we build a power plant in the year 2019 and taking into account all of the subsidies that exist in 2019, which means some of those renewable subsidies are going to go away, and what would be the levelized cost of electricity. And I want to point out some. Conventional coal is $95 per megawatt hour. That would equate to 9.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And so you can see that if that's true in 2019, our electricity rates are going to probably go up, which makes some sense because right now, existing coal-fired power plant is really going to be able to create that electricity much cheaper. But this is a newly built power plant in 2019, an estimate for that. Wind is $80.3 per megawatt hour. So, should we conclude that wind is cheaper than coal? Not necessarily. We can't necessarily make that assumption, and that's what they warn us. The Energy Information Administration warns, says be careful to not interpret it quite that way, because although it is cheaper, and it is, I don't have that wind resource at the moment I need it, and so I can't just turn it on and turn it off at a moment's notice, and so I've still got to have other generation in place to be able to balance my system. And because of that, I can't just rely on wind, and so I can't really compare those two numbers quite well. The ones on the top are the dispatchable technologies. I can turn them on, off whenever I want, and the bottom are the renewable technologies that I may not be able to do that to. Maybe a little bit with hydro could be dispatchable, but not even perfect. Depends on the system. I want to bring up that natural gas here is the cheapest in their estimate in 2019 as far as the dispatchable sources, but both of those are in combined cycle where you're getting a much higher efficiency in those systems than you are with a non-combined cycle type of a system. So I also question a little bit, we have to be careful to say that what's the price of natural gas going to be? Just because the price of natural gas has been low and looks to remain low doesn't mean it won't fluctuate, and may fluctuate greatly. And so just because natural gas is the cheapest also doesn't mean we can rely on it solely. So I think that's just kind of some of the parts. The levelized cost does tell us really what, or at least it estimates what it will cost to generate electricity with that system. And we can say that wind is cheaper than coal, but we also can't say because of that's the whole story, right? There's more to the story, and so we can't rely 100% on wind, even though it may be cheaper than new coal in the future. Okay, let's move over and look at some numbers. I'm going to bring up a spreadsheet here, and let's look at some of those things. And let's zoom into this a little bigger. Let's say we have a lawn mowing business. And in that lawn mowing business, I've got a 48-inch deck lawnmower, and I really want to have a 52 or a 60-inch deck lawnmower because I can get more done. And so I'm going to buy that bigger lawnmower, and it's going to cost me $10,000. And so I put that investment in $10,000. I think that I can run that lawnmower. It takes run about 1,000 hours a year, and it's going to make me, because I can mow more lawns and get things done faster, it's going to make me about an added let's say $2,500 a year. If that's the case, then I can look at my numbers here, and I can look here. My rate of return then is 7.9% across those 5 years. My payback, let's look at all of them starting with payback. Payback is 3 years, so before my 4th year, I paid that back, or right at the start of my 4th year. So my payback is 3 years, my rate of return is 7.9%, and my net present value is $2,500, and so that's positive, and that's good. And so I've got those three, and I can determine if an investment is a good deal. Now, this is money in the future. It is not worth as much as money today, and so I do need to apply a discount rate. I'm going to apply a discount rate of 3%. And my discount rate, I apply 3%, somewhere between 2 and 3%, because that is very close to inflation, and that's the number that I'm going to try to use for discount rate. Other people might use the value of an alternate investment. That's another way to define discount rate, but I'm going to use close to inflation. And so then I have $1,400 as my net present value. And we're going to move over and look at that for solar. In this case, I have a little more complex system, but I try not to make it too complex because I want this to be simple. My PV array, in this case, is going to be 2.5 kilowatts, or 2,500 watts. Basically, that's 10 panels at 250 watts. And I put that in. In this case, my price per watt, I'm basing this number on experience from some of the installers that I know, and it's somewhere in the range of $3 to $4 per watt installed. Bigger systems are going to be a little bit less expensive, lower on that rate, and smaller are going to be a little higher. So I'm going to say $3.5 per watt installed. So I've got 2.5 kilowatts. I would say 2,500 watts times 3.5 would give me my value. Also, I have here a 30% federal tax credit that I get. I'm not going to take the REAP grant right now because I'm not a real business. I'm just a resident. And then now we'll look at what we have. In this case, I am generating $319 worth of electricity per year based on the equation that we went through earlier. And you can actually look at my calculation here, but I have it using that same estimate. And you can see that my payback here is 19 years. And that's the point at which I've paid this system off and I start making money. Is 19 years a good deal? I don't know. But when we talk about simple payback, that's what we're going to talk about, is that I'm just looking at what did it cost me, what did it make as far as savings or as far as electricity value, and what's that payback. In this case, I would have a rate of return of 3.2% and a net present value of $3,400. Now, that is the very, very basic system, but now we need to go back and add a little complexity that is real world, but we got to be careful on how and what we assume. So let's add a discount rate of 3%. That changes my, doesn't change my payback, but or my rate of return, but it does change my net present value quite substantially, only to $128. Remember, what that $128 is saying, that in today's dollars, if I build this system, I can expect that I will pay off my $6,125 investment and then gain $128 in today's dollars by the time that thing is 30 years old. That doesn't seem like all that great, but it is what it is. Now, we know that the electricity price increases over time, and it increases at a rate faster than the inflation rate. The estimate is somewhere between maybe 1 and 4%, but where is it between 1 and 4%? I don't know. And so let's say that it's 1.5%. the electricity increase, and you can see that our amount of money per value of that electricity increased, and thus it changed our numbers. Now we have a payback of 17 years, so it's a little better. Rate of return of 4.6% and a net present value of $1,400. We could also go back in and say, well, if I'm a rural business and I get 25% off of that, then my numbers look even better. My payback is 13 years versus it was 19, and now it's looking a little better. Is it looking good enough? Depends on your business, depends on what you want, but it is looking a little bit better. Now, I'm still calling this the very simple spreadsheet because there's so much more complexity to be gained from this that we have to be careful. But let's take away some of this complexity and look at some of the models that we can use. So now I'm going to go back and I've got no discount rate, no electricity inflation, only the federal tax credit, which I can get. And here, let's just look at this number so we can remember it. $3,446 is our net present value. And then let's go to our spreadsheet. This is the SAM model, or the PV watts model, that you can download from the National Renewable Energy Lab on their website, and you can run. And it will allow you to, and so I'm running PV watts residential, and it'll allow you to figure out what your location is. In this case, my location is the Beatrice Municipal Airport. That's actually my hometown, and it's about 40 miles from Lincoln, and it's just what I put in for this particular search. And it's going to give me the solar radiance for that location. I can design my system, 2.5 kilowatts DC. I can tilt it at whatever degree angle. Let's say I want to tilt it at a 40-degree angle and face it south. I can look at the system costs. And again, here I have changed these system costs to give me the $3.5 per watt DC that I wanted. I can have it degrade over time. I can change the financial parameters, whether I borrow the money or don't borrow the money. The incentives, if I have state incentives or local utility incentives. I can actually search for my electricity rate based on my utility. And honestly, across the nation, it's got almost every large utility in there. And then you can actually get it to use those rates. And those rates are quite complex. And that's what's nice about them when you start looking at rates. It's more than just the value of the electricity today. It's, in this particular one, I think I have OPPD system loaded, where they have, I don't think, maybe it's not OPPD, because OPPD has 3 tiers. But in the wintertime, they have a 2-tier price structure based on how much you use. And in the summer, they have a 1-tier price structure. That's fairly basic, but you get to certain other places in the United States, and it's much more complex, and this will take that into account. I can also put in my numbers for my house, and so I could put the kilowatt hours in January, February, March, etc., and do that. And then when I simulate that, I come up with these numbers, and I did something. Oh, I changed this. Change this back to 20. And so here we have a number 3,443, and if we were to look back at mine, 3,446. I actually got these 2 models to look the same. 19-year payback, net present value 3,443, and I'm telling you that it took me 30 minutes to get these 2 models to work the same. Because my simple model is just that, very simple. And I'll get the web address for the SAM model here before we're done. But this SAM model is very complex, and I am telling you that it will frustrate you because it'll give you numbers that you don't understand or you don't quite figure out how they got, because there are so many parameters that you can turn on and off. And so I want you to be careful when you run this PV watts model that you're either turning things off to get it basic, or you're leaving things on that you know what you're leaving on. Because if you leave all this stuff on and you try to run it, it's not going to come out with something that's what you want it to come out with. And I'll give an example of that. Let's go to our 4 kilowatt array that I ran, and in this case, my system design is 4.48 kilowatts, and I ran it based on my house's load. And so now let's change this model to do that. And in that case, we're going to do 4.48 kilowatts, same price for that electricity. We're going to have a discount rate of 3%. And so with that, I have a payback of 19 years and a net present value of $230 with a rate of return of 3%. Well, let's see what SAM comes out with when I run that same system and include some of the base parameters that they leave in. Now, it's giving me a payback of 13 years. Remember, my system said 19. It's saying that I have a net present value of $13,000. Again, what's going on? Why does it look so much better in the SAM model than in the other model? And part of that is a couple fold. In my electricity rates, again, I am running with the utilities electricity rate, not just the base 9 cents a kilowatt hour that's in my simple model. And so electricity is worth 11 cents in Omaha in the summertime. And so when I'm generating at that time, I'm getting quite a bit more value for that electricity. And so that's really helping me. Other things that it could be doing, that's the main one. See if I have anything else that I have in. I actually have it set to give me some degradation, meaning those solar panels are going to produce slightly less over time, not a lot less, but you can see that in a couple places. You can see that my annual production actually reduces over time because of that slow degradation. So you can see that with inflation that I am gaining some more money over time because of some level of inflation. Now, this SAM model does give a number that is hard to see on your screen probably, but it's important, and that's this fourth piece of information we talked about, which is the levelized cost of electricity. And the real levelized cost of electricity is 6.5 cents. The nominal with inflation built in is 9.92 cents. And from that, I could say that I can actually produce electricity with this solar array for less than I'm paying for it at the retail for this particular scenario, because my retail rate, remember, in the summer was over 11 cents. And in the winter was about that 9 cents. And so the electricity rates in Omaha are higher than other places in Nebraska, but I can actually generate for that same price. Now, the challenge I have with this system, it sounds really good. I can generate for at or less than what I can buy it for. But when I buy my electricity, I only pay for it a little bit at a time. Versus when I put this solar array in, I've got to put that $10,000, $20,000 up front. Actually, this is showing $15,600. So I'm putting that $15,000 up front, and I'm paying for all that electricity, up front. And so that's some of the challenge when you think about some of these renewables, is that if I want to prepay for that electricity, I can do that. But sometimes it's a little painful to be able to prepay for that. So I want you to pay attention to this number here for a moment, and that is the net present value of $13,000. Because I can change a parameter of what if I borrow that money? I'm going to borrow 100% of that money for 10 years at an interest rate of 2.5%, and that's guaranteed under a loan program in Nebraska, and I'm going to simulate and see what that changes. My payback period stays the same, but my net present value increases to $14,000. And that is because I didn't have that capital outlay to begin with. I didn't have the discount rate, the alternate investment of that didn't necessarily exist, and I paid for just that on a monthly basis as I paid it off in that 10 years. And because I didn't have that initial, all that outlay of money in the beginning, my net present value is actually higher. And so I can make these numbers look however I want in many ways. And so you've got to be careful when doing some of these things, not to try to falsify what you're trying to tell people. Because I could say, look, net present value is great. It's a good deal. Oh, or payback periods, 13 years. It's a good deal. Or real levelized cost of electricity is 6 cents. In this case, right here, 6 cents. 5.97 is what it says. But that's real. That's without inflation. It looks very good. But then comes the reality of, do I have the money to be able to do that up front? Do I want to try to borrow the money? How's that going to work in the long term? This one actually has my electrical load. I inputted these numbers, and so this is my house. And I want to just show you one thing on the simulation, and that is that this is the blue is the production of energy. The gray is the electrical load, or how much my house uses. And so you can see in most months, I'm underproducing. And that is important. It's more important in Nebraska than it is in other states, but because of our net metering laws, that if I overproduce, I only get avoided cost for that excess. And some utilities are paying a little higher, but generally I get lower than retail for that excess. And so it's important in some ways to undergenerate in Nebraska. If I was in other states that might roll over, I could produce more in the summer. I could produce more in the winter and maybe roll those over to the summer. And so let's try an example that might be. So let's put in a 10 kW system for my house, and that would overgenerate. And you can see that now I'm overgenerating for about 2/3 of the year. But if you can look, my payback actually went down from 13 years to 14.6. And that is because the value of this electricity that is overproduced is not as high value as the stuff that was used by my load. And so really sizing of that is important based on the laws that exist in your state. If I had a state where I could roll over it would look a lot better. Or if I had a state that would give me retail for that, or depending on what it is. And I'm not saying that laws are unfair or aren't unfair. I'm saying they are what they are, and you need to pay attention to those things. Here is the system advisor model, and you could just type in sam.nrel.gov, and I'll